What I like to talk about is really the biggest problems in the world. I'm not going to talk about the skeptical environmentalist. Probably that's also a good choice. But I am going to talk about what are the big problems in the world. And I must say, before I go on, I should ask every one of you to try to get out pen and paper, because I'm actually going to ask you to help me to look at how we do that. So get out your pen and paper. Bottom line is, there is a lot of problems out there in the world. I'm just going to list some of them. There are 800 million people starving. There's 1 billion people without clean drinking water. 2 billion people without sanitation. There are several million people dying of HIV/AIDS. The list goes on and on. There's billions of people who will be severely affected by climate change, so on. There are many, many problems out there. In an ideal world, we would solve them all. But we don't. We don't actually solve all problems. And if we do not, the question I think we need to ask ourselves, and that's why it's on the economy session, is to say, if we don't do all things, we really have to start asking ourselves, which ones should we solve first? And that's the question I would like to ask you. If we had, say, $50 billion over the next 4 years to spend to do good in this world, where should we spend it? We identified 10 of the biggest challenges in the world. I'll just briefly read them: climate change, communicable diseases, conflicts, education, financial instability, governance and corruption, malnutrition and hunger, population migration, sanitation, water, and subsidies and trade barriers. We believe that these in many ways encompass the biggest problems in the world. The obvious question would be to ask, what do you think are the biggest things? Where should we start on solving these problems? But that's a wrong problem to ask. That was actually the problem that was asked in Davos in January. But of course, there's a problem in asking people to focus on problems, because we can't solve problems. Surely the biggest problem we have in the world is that we all die, but we don't have a technology to solve that, right? So the point is not to prioritize problems, but the point is to prioritize solutions to problems. And that would be, of course, that gets a little more complicated. To climate change, that would be like Kyoto. To communicable diseases, it might be health clinics or mosquito nets. To conflicts, it would be UN's peacekeeping forces, and so on. The point that I would like to ask you to try to do is just, in 30 seconds, I know this is, in a sense, an impossible task, write down what you think is probably some of the top priorities. And also, and that's of course where economics gets evil, to put down what are the things we should not do first, what should be at the bottom of the list. Please, just take 30 seconds, perhaps talk to your neighbor and just figure out what should be the top priorities and the bottom priorities of the solutions that we have to the world's biggest issues. The amazing part of this process, and of course, I mean, I would love to, I only have 18 minutes, so I've already given you quite a substantial amount of my time, right? I would love to go into and get you to think about this process, and that's actually what we did. And I also strongly encourage you, and I'm sure we'll also have these discussions afterwards, to think about how do we actually prioritize. Of course, you have to ask yourself, why on earth was such a list never done before? And one reason is that prioritization is incredibly uncomfortable. Nobody wants to do this. Of course, every organization would love to be in the top of such a list, but every organization would also hate to be not in the top of the list. And since there are many more not number one spots on a list than there is number ones, it makes perfect sense not to want to do such a list. We've had the UN for almost 60 years, yet we've never actually made a fundamental list of all the big things that we can do in the world and said, which of them should we do first? So it doesn't mean that we are not prioritizing. Any decision is a prioritization, so of course we're still prioritizing, if only implicitly, and that's unlikely to be as good as if we actually did the prioritization and went in and talked about it. So what I'm proposing is really to say that we have for a very long time had a situation where we had a menu of choices. There are many, many things we can do out there, but we've not had the prices nor the sizes. Right? We have not had an idea. Imagine going into a restaurant and getting this big menu card, but you have no idea what the price is. You know, you have a pizza, you have no idea what the price is. It could be $1, it could be $1,000, it could be a family-sized pizza, it could be a very individual-sized pizza. Right? We'd like to know these things, and that is what the Copenhagen Consensus has really tried to do, to try to put prices on these issues. And so basically, this has been the Copenhagen Consensus process. We got 30 of the world's best economists, 3 in each area. So we have 3 of the world's top economists write about climate change. What can we do? What will be the cost and what will be the benefit of that? Likewise, in communicable diseases, 3 of the world's top experts saying, what can we do? What will be the price? what should we do about it, and what will be the outcome, and so on. Then we had some of the world's top economists, 8 of the world's top economists, including 3 Nobel laureates, meet in Copenhagen in May 2004. We called them the Dream Team. The Cambridge University Press decided to call them the Real Madrid of economics. That works very well in Europe, but it doesn't really work over here. And what they basically did was come out with the prioritized list. And then you ask, why economists? And of course, I'm very happy you asked that question, because that's a very good question. The point is, of course, if you want to know about malaria, you ask a malaria expert. If you want to know about climate, you ask a climatologist. But if you want to know which of the 2 you should deal with first, you can't ask either of them, because that's not what they do. That is what economists do. They prioritize. They make that, in some ways, disgusting task of saying, which one should we do first and which one should we do afterwards? So this is the list, and this is the one I'd like to share with you. Of course, you can also see it on the website, and we'll also talk about it more, I'm sure, as the days goes on. They basically came up with a list where they said there were bad projects, basically projects where if you invest $1, you get less than $1 back. Then there's fair projects, good projects, and very good projects. And of course, it's the very good projects we should start doing. I'm going to go from backwards so that we end up with the best projects. These were the bad projects. As you might see, the bottom of the list was climate change. Now, this offends a lot of people. And that's probably one of the things why people will say I shouldn't come back either. And I'd like to talk about that because that's really curious. Why is it came up? And I'll actually also try to get back to this, because it's probably one of the things that we'll disagree with on the list that you wrote down. The reason why they came up with saying that Kyoto or doing something more than Kyoto is a bad deal is simply because it's very inefficient. It's not saying that global warming is not happening. It's not saying that it's not a big problem, but it's saying that what we can do about it is very little at a very high cost. What they basically show us, the average of all the macroeconomic models, is that Kyoto, if everyone agreed, would cost about $150 billion a year. That's a substantial amount of money. That's 2 to 3 times the global development aid that we give the third world every year. Yet, it would do very little good. All models show it will postpone warming for about 6 years in 2100. So the guy in Bangladesh who gets flooded in 2100 can wait till 2106, which is a little good, but not very much good. Right? So the idea here is really to say, will we spend a lot of money doing a little good? And just to give you a sense of reference, the UN actually estimate that for half that amount, for about $75 billion a year, we could solve all major basic problems in the world. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want to spend twice the amount on doing very little good, or half the amount on doing an amazing amount of good? And that is really why it comes in bad project. It's not to say that if we had all the money in the world, we wouldn't want to do it, but it's to say when we don't, it's just simply not our first priority.